I'm blocking on the name, Eric Schlosser just put out a quite good book that gives a chilling history of nuclear accidents, throughout the nuclear age, focusing really on the nuclear weapons accidents, broken arrows. And it's interesting because it's kind of, we remember and forget and remember and forget. The first round of revelations about these were during the 1980s and everybody forgot about them, and now Eric Schlosser put his book out, and so it's come back to mind again. Another interesting point, of history repeating itself is the new popular thing to try to revive the nuclear power industry is small modular reactors. And who are big players in the small modular reactor business? They're the same ones like Babcock and Wilcox, for example, who have been around forever designing the relatively small nuclear reactors that power Navy ships and in particular Navy submarines. So, it's almost like one hardly knows what to say about the nuclear safety issue at this point. One of the parts of the talk that got left on the cutting room floor is, why is this stuff still around? One of the things that's interesting about the response from the peace movement about the Iran nuclear deal is, people find, and the whole debate over it over the last 15 years is, people who are passionately opposed to nuclear power find themselves in the position of not defending nuclear power, kind of remaining silent on Iran's pursuit of it. And the question that doesn't get asked, because again, and this is also related to this problem of having a political discourse that tends, once we look beyond our borders, to treat states as if they were unitary actors with a single voice. Who exactly is it in Iran who benefits from having a nuclear technology program? Amory Levins just had a very good piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists where he was talking about the tremendous potential that Iran has for solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and so forth development. Relatively small power grid, they could replace their fossil fuel driven stuff in relatively short order, most likely with far less investment than they're putting into nuclear, which among other things is extraordinarily expensive, right? And that's an important question to ask. You have to flip the question on its head. I have sort of my joke version of it is, if you see something 3 places, it's corruption. If you see it 10, it's a systemic business opportunity. And when you see something, it's an aberration in society, the first move of a critical social theory is flip it on its head, say, what is this a structural expression of? And the thing about nuclear power, we've known for half a century that it's dangerous. We've known for half a century that it's expensive. We've known for half a century that there's nothing to do with the waste. So the key question to ask is, why is it still here? And it's still here because for identifiable segments of elites around the world, and I actually didn't really start to get this until I really started looking closely at nuclear establishments in other countries. I did a whole lot of work around the US-India nuclear deal about a decade ago, for example. And you find that nuclear establishments around the world really resemble each other, whether they're public or private. It really doesn't matter what kind of a country it is. The set of strategies that they use to advance the enterprise are remarkably similar because they have the same mix of technology and organizational technique and the ideology they deploy to justify the enterprise. And when you think about it from the perspective of building sort of a protected institutional and technological enclave within a country, the connection to nuclear weapons, among other things, is a feature and not a bug, right? The potential for nuclear weapons, even the potential for nuclear weapons, generally allows you to support at least your initial research and so forth with tax dollars rather than having to go out and compete in private capital markets. the tremendous, the dangerous character of the materials, along with the potential connection to nuclear weapons, allows you to sweep an awful lot of your mistakes under the veil of national security secrecy. And it's proved to be a very successful strategy for pieces of chunks of emerging national elites to carve themselves out a place for themselves, a stable place for themselves in a very, very competitive international system. And in terms of the broader constellations, the broader coalitions that make up governments, the kind of tremendous aura of technological prowess and sort of gee whiz, onward march of science that nuclear technology has had, particularly in its early years, also helped to justify, a broader range of development projects that, for the most part, ended up benefiting elites at the top fraction of society rather than populations as a whole. So for me, our real task when we talk about this is to reframe this discourse, to disaggregate both private capital, and it isn't just capital. In India, for example, it's all public. The both weapons side and power side, it's all public, but the institutions behave the same. So disaggregate private capital in the state, start really thinking about the concrete character of the organizations that are the top tier of this global economy and that are driving us towards an unsustainable and potentially catastrophic future.
Short answer for you.
Hey, I got in part of the talk that I cut out,
The new head of the IAEA, I think his name's Amano.
Not so new. He's been around a while now.
Japanese guy.
Yeah.
And so apparently he's very pro-American, and whether this administration or the next one, whichever party that might be, comes into office, what if we say boo, he's going to jump, apparently. So what do you think about that?
Well, again, the question is, who's we? And it was very interesting, the dynamic you've seen, during the final stages of the negotiation of the deal, because you had the elements who, at least for the moment, had control of the machinery of the US government, wanted to negotiate this deal. You had very powerful opposition to it. And at least for the moment, Amano made a number of public statements that helped facilitate completion of the deal. For example, clarifying the fact that there are secret side agreements stuff was basically a red herring, that it wasn't true, that the normal thing is for safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency to be confidential. And remember, you have to remember the double-edged character of both the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is an organization that is, by its mandate, supposed to promote the spread of conventional, peaceful nuclear technology. And so there are commercial reasons for the confidential character of the safeguards agreements. Countries that are developing their nuclear technology should be able to, if they come up with something new and slick in the world of enrichment or something, they should be able to keep it confidential, providing they're not diverting materials, violating their safeguards agreements, and so on, from the perspective of the IAEA. So, as is so often the case, relatively speaking, he's not going to be somebody who would stand up to the United States perhaps as much as his predecessor. But the IAEA has a board, it's a whole bunch of countries. Once again, they have not been able to reach any kind of consensus on the new kinds of safeguards, more intrusive safeguards, in large part because there is widespread feeling that the safeguards have been abused in the past. So again.
Absolutely.
Okay, I don't know if everybody heard you, but she's saying the fact that there seems to be a function of
Yeah.
99% working their will, and the elites, 1% basically calling the shots, whether it's private nuclear power, public nuclear power, the smaller countries, the medium countries, the large countries. It seems like the model is consistent. And why don't we overthrow that thing and go with the 99%? That's the $100 question, or whatever larger amount.
Yeah.
And it's a very good question, but that's basically why we're in this room, like why we care.
It's
an ongoing.
it's not answerable. That's not a short answer question. Well, one interesting way to start thinking about it, though, is, I thought the "We are the 99% was a nice slogan, but that it wasn't very good analysis. Because, we live in a period where the concrete implement of the European originated form of modernity that now pretty much dominates the whole planet, its concrete implement is not individuals. It's really big organizations, internally hierarchical and authoritarian, that treat the whole world around them as a series of objects to be studied with all the tools of modern science in the interest of manipulating and controlling both nature and society to extract a privileged wealth stream from everything around them, all right? Big organizations. The 1% are the people at the top of those big organizations, but those organizations need thousands of scientists and engineers and propagandists and lawyers and graphic artists and IT people and so on and so forth, who make a pretty nice salary to make them run. So you have this whole secondarily privileged stratum who are pretty long-term inhabitants of these large organizations. And if you look at the untold stories of class struggle of the 20th century and of the New Deal, one of the most important aspects of it was the struggle of these rising, educated elements to carve out a stable and secure place for themselves in these new organizations. And the two main, from my perspective, the two main kind of styles of doing that were professionalization, get control of the tools of your trade, the knowledge and so forth, professional schools, licensing, and business unionism. And those were the main ways to carve out a place for yourself in government agencies and corporations and so forth. So it's more like, I don't know what the number is, like we are the 90% or something, or we are the 85% in a country like the United States. Because if you look, unfortunately, at the history of the last century, when push comes to shove, that secondarily privileged element tends to, they want to stay inside the castle and not be out on the ground with the rest of the peasantry. So that's a way to start thinking about it, why it's hard to move forward. Because it's really, a more complex picture than there's a few privileged people at the top and a vast majority who want to do something else. And, we could go on all night with this, but one of the interesting things about the actually existing forms of supposed communism is their class structure pretty much reflected this too. And those upper elements are the people who basically seize control of the productive apparatus of the Soviet Union and turned themselves into capitalists in pretty short order after the fall of the Soviet Union. So one of the main problems, it's a complicated business. First of all, we have to understand what kind of a social structure we really have now, not using models that are 50 or 75 or 100 years old. And second of all, you don't have a lot of agreement among even people with really good intentions about exactly what kind of a shape the society we want is going to have. You have vague directions we know we have to move in. We probably have to relocalize a whole lot. We know that we have to make big improvements in terms of decentralization and energy infrastructure and all kinds of stuff. But in a lot of ways, we're still at the beginnings of the kind of conversation we have to know what direction we really want to move.
Can you just summarize a little bit what you said about what is Iran going to do what would they have done, likely have done, if this agreement was not signed? What did it actually prevent them from doing?
That's one of the interesting questions, because, you know, how much do we really know about their intentions? I myself don't think that they had, or have, I certainly don't think that they have had, surely since about 2003, any intention whatsoever to try to obtain nuclear weapons. I just don't think that's the path they're on. I mean, one of the things to think about is the fact that, you know, there's a big difference between having some fissionable material that you might make a bomb or two out of it and having a nuclear arsenal. And particularly having a nuclear arsenal that means anything when you have a whole bunch of potential adversaries with big sophisticated militaries and nuclear arsenals, right? So, again, I think to answer that question properly, and this is often a source of my frustration, you know, I would love to have a staff of 125 to do research. You know, our collective way of approaching this problem in the peace movement and so forth hasn't given us very good tools to answer that question. And the reason it hasn't is because the threshold question hasn't been asked. Who is it in Iran who really wanted nuclear technology and why, right? You can't really tell how they would have been likely to go forward without, you know, beginning to ask that threshold question. So, you know, from the perspective of the peace movement, it's mainly been kind of a negative critique. You know, we've been saying, well, you know, we can identify the gaps and the lies and so forth in the propaganda narrative that we're being fed. We know some general things like negotiation is far better than going to war, and war over this would be completely catastrophic, even if they might be moving slowly in the direction of maybe getting nuclear weapons 10 years down the line, right? But to be able to start answering questions like what would they be likely to have done, you have to be doing the kind of analysis that no one's doing.
For prestige, what do you think of that? How credible is it?
Rough back of the envelope, you know, theory of how this stuff works. That's a better argument for a nuclear program than a nuclear weapon. I mean, again, I tend to see it, you know, again, and I'm thinking about in a whole bunch of different, often very difficult, you know, later emerging countries in a profoundly and dangerously competitive global setting. You know, you have elites who are trying to emerge and make themselves economically competitive and at the same time, you know, buy off their own populations to the degree necessary to remain in power and come up with their own ideological strategies for justifying the privileged share that they're extracting from their own national economies and so forth. And they're doing this in this extremely competitive international environment, right? And in that context, again, having a colorable nuclear establishment where you can be trotting out a fairly reliable set of new achievements. Look, we have centrifuges. Look, we're building a reactor and so forth. That both benefits the inhabitants of that particular set of institutions and also a broader alliance of institutions who are developing this country along the traditional Western centralized energy, energy-intensive mode of development, right? It's a whole, and one of the things you look, for example, at the US-India nuclear deal, right? And you start looking at these kinds of things, and first of all, it wasn't just a nuclear deal. You also had deals on defense cooperation. You had a US-India agricultural knowledge initiative that had stuff that you just can't make up. I'm trying to remember the US representatives to the board of that were like Archer Daniels Midland and Monsanto and somebody else that you just, if you were making it up, you would put in there, right? And so you get this phenomenon where you have the similarly situated elites in different countries working through their government, its diplomatic functions and so forth, to tie themselves to each other, form alliances, and to bind both their countries and the world economy to this same developmental path, right? So, again, without understanding better than we do, because the analysis is not being done, at least in anything I've seen in English or translated, it's very hard to know exactly how the Iranian elites see themselves as being positioned in that. And frankly, I think one of the reasons that they would love to get this deal done, they want normalization of relations with the West and with the United States because it will let those sectors advance and advance more rapidly.
The real threat has been clearly explained by U.S. intelligence in its reports to Congress on the global security situation. Of course, they deal with Iran. They point out, and I'm quoting here, U.S. intelligence, Iran's nuclear program and its willingness to keep open the possibility of developing nuclear weapons is a central part of its deterrent strategy. Going down a little bit further. So according to the CIA, veteran Bruce Rydell, he writes, if I was an Iranian national security planner, I would want nuclear weapons as a deterrent. And the reasons are pretty obvious. The reasons are it would restrict Israel and U.S. ability to conduct their foreign policy in the region because they wouldn't be able to resort to aggression and violence that easily if Iran had a deterrent policy like this.
Let me ask you a question. Which do you think Iran would prefer? The unbelievably risky, the stuff that again, you hear this, you see all of you have, Netanyahu up there with his cartoon bomb, filling it in with a magic marker. Look, we're 98% of the way there. And you hear all of this, fairly simplistic discourse. But consider, the old problem of, the hardest, it's really unwise to attempt to leap across a chasm in 2 jumps, right? For a state with adversaries who are extremely powerful militarily and have nuclear weapons, the chasm is the point where they really start to believe that you are developing and deploying a nuclear arsenal, which is not an easy thing to do. It's not easy to manufacture a significant number of weapons. It's not easy to build delivery systems that are going to have any kind of significant capabilities, particularly against very sophisticated adversaries with air defenses and so on and so forth.
What prevents Iran from defending against just a unilateral assault by Israel and the United States?
Defending against what prevents them?
They don't have any defense against the nuclear capability of the United States. They don't have,
True.
They don't have a conventional assault. But they might think twice if they did have a nuclear deterrent.
Oh, they have a pretty, I mean, they have it's a big country. It has a quite substantial military. Either Israel or the United States would suffer significant damage. U.S. forces in the region, for example, and certain U.S. allies in the region if they attempted to attack Iran. So they do have a certain measure of conventional deterrence. And again, you know, it's not a simple question of, oh, all of a sudden I have a deterrent. It's, I am going to enter into an extremely different and very, very dangerous kind of relationship with countries that are my adversaries. That's, first of all, likely to make them even more my adversaries. Deny me certain other alliances in the world because people are going to disapprove of what we're doing, you know, what this particular set of elites are doing. And then you have this extremely initial risky period facing adversaries who, among other things, have stated policies in the past, at least, of preemption. Not a very attractive prospect.
Well, the argument that because they would face instant annihilation
Yeah.
or retaliation.
You know,
So that's not an argument to, you know, that they should not have one.
it isn't?
Because if they had one, it would be a deterrent. Just like what would have happened with the Soviet Union and the United States if the Soviet Union didn't have a deterrent.
Or North Korea.
Annihilation.
Well, you know, that's actually, it's actually an interesting thought experiment, which I've engaged in on various occasions, right? You have to think about why do countries engage in total war? Because you're talking about total war. And you have the United States and the Soviet Union, two continental empires. The Soviet Union coming out of World War II just devastated and traumatized. The United States coming out, you know, on top of the heap. Both of them with really extensive internal, and in the case of the US, imperial hinterlands that could be developed and exploited with, you know, very little significant opposition. You can make a pretty good argument that the existence of nuclear weapons alone created much of the war danger between the United States and the Soviet Union because you had a strong ideological confrontation that the fantasy of the coup de main, we can end this all in a moment, which has been around, if you go back and read the history of strategic bombing, more or less since people could drop bombs out of airplanes. People were talking about this in the 20s and 30s, right? I don't think it's terribly likely that the United States, you really think it's likely that the United States and the Soviet Union would have gone at it in a grinding, years and years long, war of attrition, B-52, this is the absence of nuclear weapons, B-52s dropping bombs over Moscow's, backfire bombers, dropping incendiaries on London and New York. You think that would have happened? I mean, it's hard for me to see. I just don't see there being the fundamental drivers that usually drive great power wars being like there
Well, we have,
in the absence of nuclear weapons.
we have think tank and others that do these war simulations to see what would happen. They could maybe win a war through limited nuclear war.
Yeah.
Well,
And
there are people that are thinking
and
about that.
and the I understand.
You would even think of dropping one nuclear weapon, what would happen? So there are crazy people around the world that actually go through these experiments.
Yeah.
What would happen if you have limited nuclear warfare in a certain region, for example? Would you get a response? I mean, do we really want to chance this kind of an outcome?
Absolutely not. That's why I'm for global abolition of nuclear weapons. And have been for decades.
One other question,
I-
are you familiar with any efforts by the Soviet Union and the United States to disarm, say during the Cold War?
What do you mean efforts? How strong? I mean, there was the McCloy-Zorin proposal. You had a whole set of kind of competing. You can choose to place your own interpretation on how serious there were proposals for general and complete disarmament that began shortly after the founding of the United Nations and continued, through the Cold War. None of which went all that far.
That there were three attempts to totally disarm. The Russians or the Soviet Union proposed all three of them, and they were declined by the United States. My source is the History Commons.
I'm trying to think of that again. I mean, look at the structure of the United Nations Charter itself that the United States had a fairly significant role in putting together, right? It was envisioned. I was just, at the last talk I was giving this afternoon, I sort of pulled out the charter and I was reading through it, and you had stuff like, Article 26, which is the original conception. Article 26 called for the development of a system of regulation of global armaments, and it was to be done with the advice of the military committee to the National Security Council, and that military commission is something that also never really got started in the course of United Nations history. It was another kind of victim of the deadlock of the Cold War. And they was supposed to advise on, and this is again, straight from the inception of the charter, right after World War II, a regulation of global armaments with an aim of minimizing the diversion of resources from development and human needs, right? So you had an entire treaty structure that the US was one of the principal architects of, whose purported purpose from the beginning was to minimize armaments, provide structures for the elimination not only of nuclear weapons, but a minimization of conventional weapons as well. The Security Council in the United Nations structure taking primary responsibility outside immediate self-defense for maintaining international peace and security and so forth. And it never happened.
This is totally different, but I've enjoyed your presentation and this question so much and gotten a lot out of it, a lot of thoughts. And one thing is just, I think it's great the way that you said the nuclear power industry and the nuclear armament industry is sort of like one and the same, and it never really made that, now I understand what you're talking about. It makes sense to me. And so, if we need to promote non-nuclear power, it will help to marginalize and diminish the nuclear weapons industry as well. And so that's a really good thing for me to focus sort of my thoughts around that. But then I'm thinking of Fukushima. I just
found out that one of the people who was very helpful in trying to solve the problem of the nuclear reactors, damage and stuff, he has leukemia, he's 40 years old.
Right.
You know, and so I'm thinking, well, and Japan, you know, is a small country with a lot of people and not a lot of ways to make power. So that there's those, you know, the propaganda is such that the nuclear energy is a very viable source of energy to help the population. So, you know, what is your response to that?
They were just meat and potatoes kind of economic arguments. Certainly, if you look at the existing nuclear power reactors and so forth, they're tremendously expensive. They're one of the few technologies that has not had a positive learning curve in terms of, you know, significant reductions in cost as you've gone on. It's gotten more expensive, not less. And you have to deploy nuclear power in great big capital chunks. You know, you're spending billions and billions of dollars building a nuclear power plant, right? So when you're talking about deploying energy where it's needed, right? If you take that kind of capital and you invest it in renewables over time, first of all, aside from being more amenable to the kind of economy that I hope we're working towards, which again is working more towards decentralization and so forth, and particularly if you're also looking in the developing world, a lot of the, you know, things like wind and solar and small hydro and so forth, you can start out deploying it, you know, a village at a time, a small region at a time and so forth. You also, you know, you build a nuclear power plant, you're stuck with it for 40 years plus, right? All that capital's tied up, as opposed to being able to take advantage of successive increments of improvement of the renewables, which have been, you know, pretty rapid and growing more rapid all the time. So, and that's even just bracketing the fact that we still don't know what to do with the waste, and also with the fact that it's a dangerous technology. There's a great book by a guy named Perot called Normal Accidents, where he analyzes different kinds of technological systems and talks about why they fail and how they fail. And nuclear power plants, at least any of the designs that have been proven so far, are very, very complex. They involve physical conditions that are pretty contrary to normal human intuition and that you can only experience and monitor and so forth indirectly. And you put all of these things together, and this is the kind of technology where, because they're built and operated by human beings, and that's always going to be the case, this is why it calls them normal accidents. You know, you are always going to have a predictable failure rate for this technology. And it's a technology that, when it fails, as we've seen, can have catastrophic consequences. So you put together, you know, cost, waste. We're not even talking about the rest of the fuel cycle. I mean, the mining fuel cycle tends to get ignored. Cost, waste, risk. It's not a good technology. I mean, just ask yourself the following question. Can you build a nuclear power plant if the company is required to internalize its risk? In other words, if it's going to have to pay, either find insurance or pay the full freight for an accident? And the answer is,